I think I broke
Unlike
the fiddle
Uncle
player.
Bonsai, we don't have to pay for this by the inch.
Yes. They have a live recording where they mention that.
Part 2. I'm really glad I decided to break this into 2 videos because there is so much material here in Hades that it doesn't do it justice to try to pack it into a 15-minute thing. The other video went a little bit long, and I still have some interesting stuff that I'd like to cover. So, welcome to Part 2 of Ulysses, Hades, James Joyce. We're still in the process of burying Patty Dignam to Patty. Okay, so we left off talking about the story about Reuben J. and his son jumps over the wall. The boatman fishes him out with a pole, and then they joke about he gave him a silver florin, and then one and halfpenny too much, and you know, they all laugh about that. There is hypocrisy there in that the kid tried to kill himself. There's absolutely zero compassion about that. I suppose you could say it's a funny story because he didn't pay much. The guy's tight-fisted, I guess, is their point. But it is hypocritical, and Joyce times these hypocrisies to cross conveniently so that we can see them. And I think the hypocrisy of Simon and his, when he sees Stephen, or it's pointed out that Stephen's on the street, there's hypocrisy there. There's just a lot of hypocritical things and a lot of paradoxes. You know, the cattle going off the slaughter as they're riding the carriage off to the funeral, and then Bloom says, why not a train up to the cemetery? I mean, do the same thing for the cattle you do for the people. Just run a train up there. And it's gallows humor. It's dark, but there's a deeper subtext going on, and that's one of the reasons I want to break this video up so I would have the time to address some of this stuff. Now, up at the funeral, there is talk about taking up a collection for Dignam's kids, and they tell Simon that, and he's, yes, and then he says, oh, is that the oldest boy? He just kind of blows it off. Simon's not the guy you're going to ask for a donation. For one, he's not going to have it, and two, if he had money in his pocket, he's certainly not going to give it to kids. He's going to drink it. He doesn't feed his own kids. He's not going to feed Patty Dignam's. He's all talk. We find out later that Bloom pledged some money, and not only did he pledge, but he paid right on the spot. I believe, if I remember correctly, it comes up later. They mention it that, you know what Bloom did at the funeral? He, I believe it's 3 shillings, which is, you know, it's a bit of money. It's quite a bit of money. So, you know, Bloom actually cares enough to give some money to the family to provide for the kids until they get the insurance worked out, they say. So Bloom takes criticism for that later instead of saying, oh, well, this is quite a guy. He's a good guy. Because Bloom has thrown away the newspaper, the guy takes the paper from Bloom, and Bloom says, throw it away. The guy thinks it's a tip on a horse, throw away. So they think that because Bloom gave this tip that he also placed a big bet, which Bloom doesn't even follow the racing. He doesn't even look in the paper. But they think, because Bloom has given this tip, throwaway, that he's made a big bet, he's made this huge killing, so they think Bloom is flush. He's got lots of money today because of this horse bet. And so he's throwing it around at the funeral. He gives money to the kids, and then they get mad at him. Later, he goes, he stops in a pub, and they get angry with him because he's not buying them all drinks, because they figure he's made a killing at the horse races. So instead of giving him credit for giving money at the funeral, in fact, the guy says, he had enough money to give at the funeral, but he won't stand us around. They again, it's like the guy just can't win. Then, back on our theme of hypocrisy and paradox, we have the church, the source of comfort, but we have this bloated priest just kind of hurries through the funeral. He just goes through the motions. It's the same words. He comes out, he rests the book on his fat gut, and he just reads the words. And then Bloom says, well, it's almost like he says, well, they got to have a script. He says he's got to say something, and he's carrying the book. And much of Catholic service is that way. It's just by rote. Somebody says this, you say that. Somebody says this, you respond with that. Blah, 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 blah. Everything is pretty much that way. It's ritualized, and you get a sense that the priest is just kind of going through it. He does them all day, and Bloom thinks about that. Doesn't he get tired of this? Just the stiffs rolling in all day long, say the words over them, stick them in the ground, move on to the next one, day after day. And he wonders, geez, how many are up here? How many are buried here? He thinks about the volume of just doing this monotonous work day after day. And one of the other guys says after the funeral, he says, didn't it seem a little rushed? It just didn't have the feeling. Well, of course it didn't. It's just, it's what they do. It's a factory. It's a death factory up there. And Bloom thinks about the Catholic teaching of the resurrection of the dead, and he thinks about, the heart, pumps, thousands of gallons, year after year, and then one day it stops, and that's it. You're done. And he thinks about all the parts that are up there. There's a heart here, livers, lungs. He thinks about all these parts, and he evokes this image of like a junkyard, all rusty pumps. He says, how many there must be up here? Thousands of them. And then he says, last day, they all come up and they're rooting about for their parts. Where's my liver? And these guys that are supposed to come together and rise up on the last day, and they're all rooting about for their parts. And he just thinks it's nonsense. It's silly. It's just, it doesn't make any sense to him. And he sees the folly of it. Bloom sees the cemetery as a big human junkyard. Then he sees it as fertilizer. And he says, the botanical gardens are right next door, and everything does so great over there. They have this, and there really is a big botanical garden right next to the cemetery. And he says, that's probably why everything does so well, all that fertilizer down there. And he thinks about the flies get it first, and then the decay and the rot, and it just kind of turns him. It evokes a pretty ugly image of all this rot and decay that's below that ground there. This big human junkyard. And then he sees a rat. And he sees a rat kind of going down into a crypt, and big rat, grandfather rat. And he says that would pick a guy clean in a short order, just a few minutes. So Bloom sees this as just, when you're dead, you're dead. He makes that clear. And the rest of this stuff is not important. This is not a place for Bloom. Bloom's place is with the living. And one of the great cores of Ulysses is that it's very affirmative of life. It's not about to wallow in death. It's not about to wallow in defect and slovenliness and drunkenness. It's not going to wallow in that stuff. It's not going to wallow in the past. It's affirming of life. And Bloom doesn't see this as a place for him. He doesn't want to be there. It starts to, I'd say it kind of creeps him out, but he just is tired of it. He just doesn't want to be there. His place is with the living, and he wants to get out of there, go to work, get on with life, and enjoy food and company and people and stuff. He wants to get back in life and out of this place. On the way up to the cemetery, incidentally, another one of the hypocritical paradoxes that are pointed out is they pass a house where a murder was committed, and then they talk about Seymour Bush got the guy off, and then they say, oh yes, it's better for 99 guilty men to go free than a single innocent man be in prison. That's the foundation of our legal system. And they make these pompous pronouncements, and yet, these guys don't believe that. They don't care about that stuff. And then Bloom thinks, they like this stuff. People love murder mysteries, and he goes through some examples. They love to read these stories, found the head in the backyard and that kind of stuff. They love that stuff. People love it. So even though this murder is so repugnant, this is something we like. And if, one of the remarkable things about Joyce is how current this stuff is. If you didn't know and you picked this book up, except for maybe getting in a carriage, if somebody said this was written 2 years ago, you could easily believe it and adapt it, because what do we watch on TV? Murder, mayhem, police stories. It's as popular today as ever. The things that Joyce writes about are timeless. Same stuff. Now, again, I want to focus on Bloom's victory here. He's done his baptism. He's now gone through his tempering. He is now stronger, wiser. His eyes are opening to things. He's beginning to become a stronger person. He's facing things, and he's beginning to bloom. Okay? So he sees the folly of this death ritual, and he realizes his place is not with the dead. This is not where Bloom belongs. He belongs with the living, the now, flesh and blood, the warm bed. He gets it. His eyes are beginning to open. This place is not going to claim Bloom. It's going to claim the others. As Simon says, it's all soon enough. I'll be right there. And it's probably true. And the other guys they ask about, he's dead, this guy's dead, this guy's not a thing between him and heaven, and he's dead. There's death all around. And these funerals are, they're booked a dime a dozen. And the guy asks, how many we got tomorrow? We got 2 already on, one at 10:30, one at 11. Okay, it's a grind. But this is not a place for Bloom. The final affront to Bloom comes at the end, and I'd like to try to read this. I'm not great at reading, but I'd like to read this ending. The funeral is over. They're walking. This guy is asked about who is that guy, and they say, "Oh, that's Bloom." And Mrs. Marion Tweedy. That's his wife, and Marion Tweedy. They just can't refer to her as Mrs. Bloom. She's always Marion Tweedy. As the letter that came, Mrs. Marion Bloom, it should be Mrs. Leopold Bloom in proper format of that time. They still refer to her independent of him. So they have that, and then the guy says, well, why did she ever marry him? He's no good. So, and then they walk on, And Bloom is behind, and he notices this guy's hat is smashed in the back. Probably, they were all kneeling, and you notice Bloom puts his newspaper down so he doesn't get his pants dirty. And he puts his hat on his other knee to protect it. And this guy might have dropped his hat or kneeled on it or something, but his hat's got a dent in it. So at the end, they're walking, and Bloom makes some gesture, and they stopped. "Your hat is a little crushed," Mr. Bloom said, pointing. John Henry Menton stared at him for an instant without moving. Gave it one of those looks, like, "What do you want?" "There," Martin Cunningham helped, pointing also. John Henry Menton took off his hat, bulged out the ding, smoothed the nap with his coat sleeve, clapped the hat on his head again. "It's all right now," Martin Cunningham says. John Henry Menton jerked his head down in acknowledgement of Martin Cunningham, of course. "Thank you," he said shortly. And then they go on. He doesn't, again, acknowledge Bloom. Now Bloom thinks in his mind. They walked on toward the gates. Mr. Bloom, chapfallen, drew behind a few paces so as not to overhear. Ever respectful, Bloom just drops back like, "These guys, they're not my friends. I tried. He doesn't care about me." Martin laying down the law, probably talking politics or, that kind of important kind of nonsense. Martin could wind a sappy head like that round his little finger without his seeing it. Oyster eyes. Now that just is a beautiful evocation of, you ever seen that, some old slushy drunk with the milky, it's just perfect evocation of this guy. Oyster eyes. Never mind. Be sorry after, perhaps, when it dawns on him. Get the pull over him that way. Thank you. And then the great finish to this episode. How grand we are this morning. What BSers. What a bunch of malarkey this is. Bloom sees the folly, the hypocrisy, the nonsense of the ritual. He sees it all. And it's just, he realizes it's just not for him. He's not part of this. How grand we are this morning. I think it's a fabulous line. Now, I want to wrap this up with a couple of thoughts. Bloom leaves the cemetery a stronger character than when he entered that carriage after the bath. He's thought a lot about death. He's seen this ritual. He's been around the guys for this amount of time, hour and a half, whatever it is. And he's a different character than he was in the earlier episodes. We see him first making breakfast for Molly, sort of almost doofy, fumbly. He doesn't want to acknowledge what's going on between her and Boylan, so he kind of stumbles around that, and he runs off to buy a kidney, and he's ogling some woman's behind, and he's got this little sort of giddy, immature perversity. So we see this character who has intellect but lacks some basic maturity, and he's not able to really face things. He thinks about them, but he doesn't deal with stuff. He's not really facing it. He is a different guy now. Since this visit to the cemetery, he has seen the heroes. He's seen the legends. He's dealt with death. He's seen the ritual. He's seen the friends. He's seen a lot in the last hour and a half. The cattle off the slaughter. They've talked about a lot of stuff, and he's starting to get it. They don't respect him. They don't like him. He understands that. You know, that last line about how grand we are today. He gets it, okay? So Bloom is beginning to wake up. Now, remember when Molly asked him for what does this word mean? Metempsychosis. What is that? And he says, well, that's the transmigration of the soul. You know, she says, oh, rocks. You know, tell us who he is when he's at home. You know, what is that? What are you talking about? What does that mean? And he explains about reincarnation. Now, what I believe this book is, you know, people say, well, he's chasing the Odyssey, so it's Bloom is in search for his son. I don't believe that's the case. Stephen is not his son. He mourns the loss of his son, certainly, no doubt about it. But I don't think he's seeking a son. I think he likes Stephen. I think he feels for Stephen because he doesn't have much of a father, and I think you'd like to have a relationship and mentor Stephen. But I believe that the book is about the metempsychosis of Joyce himself. I think he is blooming from Stephen, this self-centered, literary, unfocused character who is unresolved in many issues. He's unresolved in his mother's death. He's unresolved in his religious views. He's unresolved in how to stand up for himself when his friends displace him and take the key to his living. He's unresolved in how to deal with his employer, who is an anti-Semitic bigot. He doesn't stand up to him. Stephen is really pretty immature, and he gets paid, and what's he want to do? He gets drunk and goes off to the night town where the hookers are. And then we have Bloom, who is the older man, but he has his little perversities and his own issues and immaturities. And I believe that the entire book is a metempsychosis, in that Stephen, who is definitely the Joyce character in the previous books that Joyce wrote, Stephen Dedalus is the alter ego of James Joyce. It's autobiographical, the things that happened. But I believe in Ulysses that we see the character evolve from Stephen into Bloom. We see a metempsychosis where we see Bloom, okay, and he becomes the mature, adult, resolved man. He deals with his own foibles and his beliefs. And I believe in this chapter he faces his religious beliefs. He faces his thoughts about death. For one of the big things, for example, if you pull religion out from somebody, then that leaves the question of what about death? So take away religion, then what happens when you die? That's the big question. That's the question that religion fills. So what happens when you pull that out? It's great to say, love your neighbor and have a better life and all that stuff, but that's not really what it's all about. Religion is really there to give you an answer about what happens when you die. Now, if you pull it out, what's there? Can you face when you're dead? You're dead, and Bloom does. He reaches that realization. Now, remember, he converted to Catholicism so he could marry Molly. I don't think he ever really bought it. He doesn't really understand a lot of it. But here, he's quite clear in that he not only doesn't get it, he doesn't need it. And this is where the mature Joyce begins to come through. And this is where Stephen is still conflicted. Stephen is still, the Mulligan calls him the Jesuit. And he's still not sure. He plays both sides. And it's like Mulligan says, you won't kneel for your own mother's death, but then you'll wear the black, mourning clothes. You won't put on a gray suit, what is kind of hypocritical. And he's very unresolved. But in this episode, I think we see Bloom is clear. I think it becomes clear to him that he doesn't believe this nonsense, and he doesn't fear death. You pull the religion out, and he's not left with a vast black hole beneath him. He is on solid ground, you know. So you take the religion out, Bloom doesn't fall. The other ones would. They have nowhere to go. There's nothing else for them. They have to have it. Bloom realizes in this episode, in his trip to Hades, he doesn't need it. So I would say that this is a big part of Bloom's Bloom. And we're beginning to see Bloom as a character transmogrify. He's growing. So I think that's the reason that the name Bloom was chosen, that we see Bloom. This is a PS. I have to insert this. There was a couple of things I wanted to mention in the video, and it got longer and longer and longer, and I wanted to mention these two very important things. This guy, John Henry Menton, was Dingham's employer. Now, you're going to find represented in many of the quick notes kind of websites. I won't mention anybody specifically, but if you go to the quick notes, cliff notes type websites that explain this, they say that this guy used to work for Patty Dignam and got fired for drinking, and that's not the case. It's the opposite. Dignam used to work for this guy, Menton, who is a solicitor lawyer, and Dignam was a clerk, and he got fired for drinking, probably drinking on the job. They just said that it's why'd he get fired? It was the drinking. So whether it was on the job or not showing up for work or whatever it was. So you will often find that wrong in the short notes sites. So I wanted to clarify that, where they say, you know, what's that all about? They say, oh, he was fired for drinking. They don't mean Dignam fired this guy. Dignam is the one that got fired. There's another reference in here that I wanted to mention that I think is really important, and I'm going to read it from the book, because I say that Bloom faced death and realized it's not for him. So I wanted to add this. The gates glimmered in front, still open. Back to the world again. Enough of this place. Brings you a bit nearer every time. Last time I was here was Mrs. Sinico's funeral. Poor Papa, too. The love that kills. And even scraping up at the earth at night with the lantern, like that case I read, to get at fresh buried females, or even putrefied with running grave sores. Give you the creeps after a bit. I will appear to you after death. You will see that my ghost after death. My ghost will haunt you after death. These are all thoughts that Leopold has, all this junk that's around this cemetery stuff. And as he says, back to the world, he's had enough of this. This place is not for him. Now, there's a reference here to the letter that he got earlier from his little sort of dalliance. And you remember she made what appeared to be a typo. And I pointed that out. And it's referred here in Hades. And let me see. There is another world after death named Hell. I do not like that other world, she wrote. Now remember, it appeared that she meant to say, I did not like that other word. There was a typo, and it's often misread by people. But she actually says, I do not like that other world. Let me see. I do not like that other world, she wrote. No more do I. Plenty to see and hear and feel yet. Feel live, warm beings near you. Let them sleep in their maggoty beds. They are not going to get me this innings. Warm beds, warm, full-blooded life. That's Bloom. Thanks. Sorry I had to inject this. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to mention. The man in the Macintosh. Now, they spot him. This is one of the great mysteries in literature. Nobody knows who the man in the Macintosh is. They see him, Bloom sees him, and then Bloom thinks he's an apparition. Bloom thinks, I'm the only one that sees him. And the Macintosh is a raincoat. It's a rubber coat. And he doesn't know who the guy is. He seems to be on the periphery of things. And he wasn't at the service in the chapel, but he's there at the graveside in this Macintosh. Now, nobody else is dressed in a raincoat, and the weather cleared. We know that. It's not a heavy rain day. The day started out clear, warm. Bloom walked off to the butcher shop, talked about how warm it is. So it's not a day where you're expecting a heavy downpour. So this guy's dressed a little oddly. And Bloom thinks he's the only one that sees him. And he wasn't at the service, so it's kind of weird that he just shows up graveside. And Bloom counts all the attendees, and with the guy in the Macintosh, there's 13. Superstitious, and Bloom thinks, oh, that's the number of death. And then he dismisses that, and that's silly superstition. And then he thinks, well, I don't think anybody else sees the guy anyway, And then later, the guy's running around trying to get the names so they can publish them in the paper of who attended the funeral. They're going to run an obituary, Patty Dignam's funeral today, attended by da-da-da. We find out that he gets Bloom's name wrong, and he puts Boom in the paper. And he asks him, who was that other guy? The guy in the coat. And Bloom says, Macintosh? And the guy says, oh, okay, Macintosh, and he walks away, and then Bloom tries to stop him, like, wait, no, that's not his name, wait. And he realizes, well, I guess other people can see him too. I don't know who the heck that guy was. Who was he? Well, I'd like to do a little short video next on Macintosh, because I have a theory I'd like to put out there, and I'd like to open it for discussion, because I think I know who Macintosh is. So again, thank you. Comments down below. I'd really appreciate it. And thank you for watching. Stay with me. To Patty Dignam. And better yet, to Bloom.